Hello, welcome to the last event of the 24th Witte Lecture Season. My name is Kungo Wangmo, and I'm the Acting Director of the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation in Orange County, California. Thank you for inviting us into your home this evening. This evening, we welcome our loyal members and new guests from near and far to the Library Foundation's virtual auditorium. What you need to know about this program tonight is that we are recording it, and if you want to ask a question, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The 24th season of the Witte Lectures is made possible by all the sponsors you saw in a slideshow, plus all our ticket holders, dedicated foundation members, the Witte Committee, and the Witte family. Thank you all for going above and beyond to make our programs possible and to help us fulfill the Foundation's mission of providing funds to purchase valuable analog and digital resources for the library. Thank you to all. To find out more about the Foundation, how to support the Newport Beach Library, and buy tickets for the upcoming Library Live program with authors Stephen Rowley and Samantha Dunn, please visit our new website at nbplf.foundation. Now, I'm going to hand you over to John Cunnan, who is a member of the Witte Committee. He will introduce our guest, Shahzia Sikander, who will be in conversation with Meg Linton. John, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our 24th season. As many of you know, the series was founded in 1996 in honor of Martin Witte, a man who loved the idea of a library and a library card, just like us. The purpose of our series is to offer our community the best speakers on topics such as science, art, culture, and politics. We could not do this without our generous sponsors, and remarkably, in the face of the pandemic, our sponsors have stepped forward to support us, not knowing how or when the series would come off, but it's done really, really well. So thank you. Also want to recognize the members of the Witte Committee, as well as Kunga Upshaw and Sean, our foundation team, who make this all happen. Tonight, we will have the pleasure of hosting Shahzia Sikander. Sikander will be in conversation with Meg Linton. Meg, our beloved Meg Linton, former Chief Executive Officer of the Newport Library Foundation. And Meg, by the way, has a wonderful knowledge of art history, so she is really the perfect person to do this. Shazia is a Pakistani American. She is an influential artist celebrated for figurative painting, sculptures, and installations inspired by traditional Persian miniatures. She will discuss her latest artwork, exhibitions, and her forthcoming book, Shahzia Sikander, Extraordinary Realities. We will learn how she expands and subverts traditional themes to explore cultural identity, gender, and other represented narratives. Sikander received a MacArthur Fellowship in 2006, and she was awarded the State Department Medal of Arts in 2012. Her work has been exhibited all around the world, including the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. Please welcome me in please join me, in welcoming the fascinating Shahzia Sikander to the Witte Lectures tonight. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Shahzia is going to join us in just a second. So I'm Meg, and thank you, John, for that lovely introduction. I just wanted to give a little intro myself to Shahzia. I first met Shahzia when I launched the Jennifer Howard Coleman Distinguished Lectureship and Artist Residency Program at Otis College of Art and Design. It was a 5-year project funded by the Samuel Goldwyn Foundation. This was about the time that Shahzia got the MacArthur Genius Grant Award in 2006, and it's been a pleasure seeing her career develop and her work develop over the last few years. There's several reasons why I wanted to bring Shahzia into the library and be with us tonight. First, her work stems from her immense knowledge of the history of Indo-Persian illuminated manuscripts, or the Persian miniature paintings. She uses text and image. They're her inspiration, which allows her research and her artwork to exist in both libraries and museums, two personal passions of mine. And I know of many in the audience. She also refers to her figures in her work as protagonists or antagonists, and the images can have main plots, subplots, and other narrative components. So I thought that was perfect for the context of the library. The second reason is, as John mentioned, she's the subject of the new book edited by Sadia Abbas and Jan Howard called Extraordinary Realities, that offers a visual chronology of Shazia's work from 1987 to 2003. The book is also the inspiration for the upcoming exhibition at the Morgan Library in June. So if many of you are getting your vaccinations and can travel, I encourage you to go see it. And this book, it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. It's published by the RISD Museum, the Rhode Island School of Design's museum, and a publisher out of Germany called Hirmer. And it's being distributed by the University of Chicago Press. So it's got some weight behind it, which is really lovely to have all those wonderful institutions promoting her work and supporting her work. The imagery in the book, as you will see tonight, because we're going to go through the book, is absolutely beautiful. And the essays and interviews, I've read the book cover to cover, are very enlightening. And it talks about education and politics, the challenges of being a contemporary artist working on a global stage, and also in her situation, oftentimes being the spokesperson for her culture, her gender, her art, religion, and even nation. So, and then finally, the third reason I wanted to bring Shazia is because she is an internationally renowned artist, and the influence and importance of her work and ideas of her generation, especially presented in this book, will continue to grow, and their importance will be revealed over time and will grow richer. And I just thought this would be a great introduction for our audience to learn about her work. And I've asked Shazia, because for many of you, this is the first time seeing her work, to put together a slideshow so we can explore her art and ideas together. And so welcome, Shazia. We're so thrilled that you're here. And I think we should just dig into the images.
Thank you so much, Meg. That was such a generous introduction. And I was remembering our wonderful time working together, which is now more than
a long time ago.
A long time ago, yeah. But very, and the essay you wrote was very instrumental in one of the writers. In fact, the editor really enjoyed reading some of that scholarship on my work. So yeah, so as you mentioned, the book is a little bit like a retrospective also, but it does focus very much on the 1990s, and for me that was very essential because so much of that time gets glossed over for many artists of color, especially artists like myself, that that I didn't grow up in the US, but now I've been in the US for almost 30 years. So it was very interesting to have this sort of reflective opportunity to look at the practice, but also other aspects and dimensions of what it means to be making art in America at that time in the 1990s, and also how it connects, to so much of the other artists' work that I was looking at, that I was inspired by. So in that sense, it takes you outside of that very limited representation of just being, the other, the outsider. So that's so when I think of this book, I'm thinking really that it is bookended sort of, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the military dictatorship of the 80s in Pakistan, the war in Afghanistan that's unfolding, the Gulf War, and then of course it sort of goes right up till 2002. So like the 9/11 situation. So it's also the sort of years as a young artist, what it means in terms of influences and engaging with the legacy and the residue of colonial history in Pakistan, and also what it means coming to the US at that age, and when art world was not that diverse. So there's lots of conversations with artists that I have crossed paths with that early on in the 90s and in the late 90s, and how some of those conversations allow another read of the work. And then of course, there was this wonderful opportunity to have a conversation with the master teacher that I learned miniature painting with. In fact, my teacher from the Rhode Island School of Design, Dennis Congdon, a fantastic painter himself, he traveled with the editor to Pakistan to conduct this conversation. And so that's also recorded. So I kind of wanted that. I wanted that I shouldn't be the spokesperson about my story. Like let others kind of weave it out and talk with other people and talk with other artists and develop that context. So that's where that book is.
Can you start with it's Bashir?
Yes.
Like,
so
because of the program, because how you kind of came to miniature painting, because I think that's, you had some political battles you had to fight just to get into school and to study miniature painting.
Yes. So, you have to go all the way back. Yeah. In 1988, when I start miniature painting with Bashir, or 1987, when I start the National College of Arts, at that time, it was considered very kitsch, very derivative. And you have to understand that too is again a very colonial legacy history of how this idea of tradition is stigmatized. And
because it was really being more geared towards the tourist trade, right?
Yeah, much more towards tourist. And of course in India there's a big tourist industry, and for that's how I was also thinking. I didn't understand the diversity, but you also have to really realize that for people like myself that grew up in Pakistan at that time, majority of the art and this visual traditions of the region are in institutions in the West. So like the Met or the British Museum, that's a colonial legacy. They collect majority of that work. So that's why it's very interesting when I get the opportunity to look at the actual artworks, which I've had over the years in various institutions. That experience of seeing the real material versus the facsimile or the representations in books and catalogs is a profoundly different experience that I had. And also I think the term itself, miniature painting, is very problematic. It's a very colonial term. So to explain the best, it's hard to explain what all it covers because it covers so much ground, is that these are the painting traditions of South Central Asia. And they also have a different, it comes out of book illustration, illuminated manuscripts, but covers a very vast geographical area as well as history. So
Shazia, I'm going to interrupt. So when we see these images, a lot of them have been taken out of books, right? And they're in books, but they also have been removed from books.
Yes. So because again, manuscripts have been cut out, and they have been cut out and dispersed and dismembered for profit in secondary markets. And that is what truncates this sort of canon of South Asian pictorial history tradition. And that's what I was really interested in, is then what does it mean that when you study the provenance of these objects? And in digging into the archives at that time, you start understanding that so much of one's grasp and knowledge of it is being informed by how it's being written about, or how it was really written about, again, in a very Eurocentric manner. So that's sort of, but at the same time, when I looked, there's so much range and variety, like even these two examples, like as a visual artist, I am deeply inspired by the beauty of the line, the composition, the mythical nature, so much of it, like the visual curiosity that I brought when I started perusing a lot of this material was has given, so many different ideas and continues to kind of work as fodder for my thought and works that I make. But going back in time, like these are some of the examples of how I came about. I would copy the older paintings. And that was just part and parcel of learning it also, like to get into the understanding of materiality, how to construct. But simultaneously, I was looking at this like example, like the Iranian Safavid painting, for example, on the right side, which is also is informing a work I was doing as a student. And then that also leads to my sort of this very significant work, the scroll painting, which was made, again, when I was a student, but it launched what is now called the neo-miniature or the contemporary miniature. And in here, you can see that, I was inspired by a lot at that time by a variety of women people, like women in the Women Action Forum, activists, poets, playwrights, friends of mine. And this is, the environment is the military dictatorship. So like limitations on women's rights are happening. And I knew that like I couldn't freely roam around the city. So then I thought that why not make the work in the house that I would be spending most of my time in. So then the protagonist in this becomes the house too. So you see this character, which is this female character, which is moving through the space, always sort of restless, diaphanous, passes through time, but it's not really kind of rooted in any particular moment. And that is also sort of, for me, the claiming the freedom of the body, the female body, and then that becomes sort of the protagonist in the work. It could be a self-portrait, but it's not necessarily tied to that idea either.
Shazia,
yeah,
I also want to say, like, using this type of subject matter was a bold step for you. And also there weren't many women who were studying miniature painting at this time either, right? So this was really a bold act, wasn't it?
It is a bold act in the sense that, at that time, it was considered very derivative and not a avant-garde form. So why, instead of like moving forward, it was assumed that you're moving backward, and it was discouraged. And I was kind of discouraged many times. But at the same time, the more people I started involving and bringing into, I started to shift people's opinion too. And whether it was other faculty as well as many more younger artists on the sidelines that started, even like a few years later, when I come to the US and the work starts getting a lot more attention, soon after graduate school, it signaled back that, there was possibilities that you could engage in traditional forms. And also I was questioning what exactly is traditional form? Who gets to define and determine that particular work that particular work is going to be considered traditional? So, it was a lot more things that were at stake that I was engaged in. Also, how it's full of possibilities. So
yeah, you were changing the narrative up too of what were acceptable narratives traditionally, and you're breaking it out.
Yeah, definitely. And and also sort of like, I think when you look at the real material and you look at the art, it was a complete different experience than never seeing the details. That so much of the detail in there is not even visible to the naked eye. So that sort of privilege that certain people won't have. So that privilege of looking at material which is no longer in Pakistan, it's outside of the country, and then that takes on a very different political lens, because that then you really have to really understand the history, the colonial history, and so much of these objects don't necessarily carry very clear documentation of the provenance either. So those the more I studied, the more it yielded possibilities of new narratives. Just one example right here would be, you know, when I was looking at this work, which is sort of a very particular page out of the court paintings. So it's obviously depicting the life of a Mughal era. But then I also wanted to understand how it crosses over or intersects with the East India Company's history in South Asia, what that means. So that leads to my making a video work called The Last Post, which you see here on the side. And then, you know, like for that work in particular, like The Last Post, I was also working with a composer from Shanghai and looking at the opium trade between India, via the East India Company's history, but like the Opium War. So the music is, you know, created again in partnership with somebody from Shanghai, who's also a friend of mine now, who I've worked together. So as two women working in the US who've grown up looking at, you know, classical histories and music in different genres, and then kind of developing a collaborative piece, also opens up the idea of the book, opens up the idea of a manuscript in many more ways so it's sort of like a dismantling that's more internal than just like from just an external position. And that's sort of one example. The other example that I thought would be interesting to share here was you see this actual manuscript, which is in Philadelphia Museum's collection, called The Rose Garden of Love, Gulshan-e-Ishq. And I made a piece that is in response to this particular work. But when the museum invited me, you know, I first thing that came to my mind was like, how many artists painted this epic poem? So, and how many copies of this manuscript exist? And how is the story determined every time from the several thousand verses that are written? So there's this epic poem with several thousand verses that there are no, you know, not like I wasn't privy to the translated verses themselves. I was given a synopsis of what the story is. And I was like, I don't want to be limited by that synopsis. So either I'm going to imagine a different story, because I was also questioning who gets to tell the story. And so much of these the projects that I do, for me, it's really is about understanding the history and the account of movements, that is of objects and bodies, and how, you know, migration, trade, colonial occupation, slavery, like how they are the undercurrents and the root axis of modernity, and how histories are told and narrated, and how in so much of that history and narration, women are missing. And, you know, whether women are expunged from either the political discourse or the historical narratives, what does that mean for me as an artist now in being invited to engage and look at this material also? So that's where I didn't want to be, where I wanted to understand the story, but as a visual artist, obviously taking much more freedom. But at the same time, when so much of that text around the book here is in Dakkani Urdu, which is very few scholars are there to translate it. Mm-hmm. Then, you know, do we just go by the English synopsis of a page written by the institution? Like these are very valid questions, but as a visual artist, for me, they allow me to fill in the gaps and imagine them and take a different stance than what maybe an art historian might.
So can you describe what we're seeing a little bit in terms of, if you could go back, like we're seeing the book and the case, but then we're seeing, are there projections of images that are happening?
So yeah, so what happens here is that these are stills from my piece. Mm-hmm. So what you see on the left is also, I'll get to it, but these are like these bursts are made out of the wings of the angels or the fairies that in the story are a device that whenever the protagonist is dreaming, the fairies appear, or the fairies are carrying this idea between what is real and what is imagined. And the story unfolds through that device. So I took the wings from all those characters and then used them as a code, and then all these bursts that happen in the animation itself, in the video, are made from that element. And then also the little black forms here, you know, those are little look like birds or bats. They are also the silhouettes of the female hair.
Yeah.
So some of these characters that sort of play on notions of flight, but are really are departures from the iconography that's very much embedded in the piece. And then the score also is in partnership with the composer and also lyricist and another vocalist, Ali Sethi, who's again has tremendous training and an experience in the Indian ragas. So his navigation of the work brings in yet another third layer. So I think in that respect, I'm
so I'm going to interrupt for a second. So it's really, you guys are having a conversation with this historical text.
Absolutely.
Visual and musical and conversation and kind of pulling out and telling your own narrative.
Well, no, and also situating the actual book was made in, you know, at a time in central India in the Deccan period, which is very plural. So, you know, so this idea of how what one is doing now is not something, you know, we live in cultures and histories that was incredibly syncretic.
Yes.
And this obsession with binaries is what, you know, so many times that's what I think my work sort of delves in, is that how to create an interdisciplinary approach and how to also like what it means to create a new take on this illustrated manuscript. So that's what I think the plural spirit of the manuscript is reflected in the multiplicity of both its oral as well as visual languages. So that's where the title comes from. Disruption is rapture. And, you know, in the piece, there's motion graphics, South Asian lyrical poetry, there's Western opera, orchestral music, Indian ragas, Gregorian chants. It's also it's in high resolution in 4K. It gives it a very different sort of possibility of scales and elasticity. So it has been exhibited so many in different ways. So it steps outside of the confines of the vitrine, outside the confines of the room, the space of the museum. So I kind of those things.
These projections are presented outside in the environment then.
Yeah, and you hear the music is part of it. So like this piece was part of the Nuit Blanche Festival. So thousands of people came to see it. It was running, you know, throughout the day and night. And the music you can hear the music. And so you can see the space, so you can walk around, experience it, which is very different of an understanding versus, you know, even like being here where we were able to show it at the Alhambra Gardens, but also at the Lahore Fort in Pakistan, in Lahore. So a different audience. And then that's why when, you know, the ability to bring in different elements with local musicians allows this sort of like borderless idea where the music can be performed live. And when it's performed live, it's open for change. It's open for kind of allowing the things that will happen in time and space. So yeah, you had asked me to, you know, share a few images where I can explain a little bit of the iconography.
Yes.
And so some of these works, which will be in my retrospective that opens at the Morgan Library Museum in June this year. So that's why I'm sharing them, because, you know, we were working on the book as well as like just in general revisiting so much of this work that I haven't seen myself in 20 plus years. So it's very exciting for me to also share this. So like, for example, the image on the left, so that you see that lotus. So for me, that lotus is basically the umbilical cord and kind of the life force, which could be, could be the female, which is also the mother, but then this sort of reference of the multi-layered kind of avatar is also about pulling from a heterogeneity of South Asia. So it's never, usually my narratives would often be about a binary would be imposed on them, like it's as if it's just Hindu and Muslim, but it isn't. It's Jain, Buddhist, Islamic, Hindu, Sikh, Zoroastrian, Jewish, cultural, like this Christian, like these, there's so much history and diversity that's embedded in so much of this visual histories in the manuscripts that I'm like inspired by and culling from. So that's also one thing. Then I was thinking about the paradox of rootedness. So I made this work when I was in Houston, and I was also observing how, there's so many multiple immigrant narratives and nationalisms in the US, depending on which city. So comparing Houston to New York and questioning sort of like what is assimilation versus foreignness. And that's what her foot on the loops or that ghost-like figure is, maybe, a shadow or this kind of notion of the other. So what constitutes the myth of an assimilated immigrant in the US? So that's kind of one. Then here is another image, Ready to Leave. It highlights a female where you can't see her face, but in front of her is this hybrid creature, which could be the griffin, but it's also a very local, in Punjab, a vernacular would be chalava. The word chalava would basically be, is like the ghost. So it's also, for me, the cultural amnesia. It's also the idea of who's visible or not visible. And then it's, the chalava is about a mythical, like it's a farm animal that disappears as urbanization starts to happen in Punjab. So chalava was often something like my grandmother would call me, for somebody who's so swift, they would be in and out so fast and you couldn't pin them down. So here I was playing with that kind of iconography in the proximity between the female and this mythical creature. So kind of, confronting from me this, who's swift, who's transient, who's uncapturable. So that
Shazia, how do you deal with people who may not have this background knowledge and sharing, and how much are you concerned with people just really just enjoying the visual pleasures of your work, but then how do they come to understand like the significant mythologies that are behind the work and how you're putting the images together and so forth?
Yeah, so for example, like this work, whatever, it's done a long time ago, right? So the Witte Museum will probably continue to write about it the way they want to write about it. But recently there have been amazing conversations with other historians that are very present in the US, like Manan Ahmed, who teaches at Columbia. He has written a whole chapter on the chalava. And when he and I had a conversation, so many, not just South Asian, so many people stepped in to engage and dissect. So it depends on the circuits you're part of, right? And what you may not necessarily know is that how so much of this information can be valid again, it's in cycles. Like this work has received so much, has been deconstructed in just recently. So the fact that I made it then, and the fact that, these conversations are now online, and maybe they will influence how the museum that has collected the work will start to write about it. My work is part and present of that critique.
Right.
Like,
but you're not trying to control a specific narrative. This is all
No, I'm not. I think it's reflective of the changing times as well, that the things that I painted 20 years ago may not have gotten, may not have been reviewed then, but now 20 years later, so much of the work seems to be of interest because there are many more South Asians, there are more people of color in positions of spaces where they either are writers or authors or critics or other artists or, and then they are centering their stories. So then all of a sudden, the work is resonating with a different generation simultaneously.
Right.
So that for me is exciting, but it also, in there are the burden that one has carried for a while. So again, like I was working on how, the other characters started to appear in my work. So collaborations of this nature where I've worked with Sharmila Desai, and she choreographed dances and performances, and then she starts to enter the work. So you see how that's happening. I very broad notions of children's tales, of the representation of the young female, and in stories that are very global, but they have like very strange representations of women. So I was kind of deconstructing that and thinking in terms of the idea of structures of book writing, book histories, illuminated books. And so all of these paintings play with kind of reimagining or deconstructing sort of, the exclusionary ideas that are within race representations. But rejecting sort of, if you're rejecting the colonial or the male gaze, then what are the archetypes? Identifying the archetypes to tell maybe richer stories or different stories. And that's what starts to happen here. So you may get fascinated or be, I'm a visual artist, so I want people to be interested in the visual dynamics of the work. But once you are driven in and you start seeing, then you start also seeing sort of layers of humor that are in there too. And those are things that I'm happy with. Of course, some things, there are more layers that with, as people ask or inquire, they will find resonance in different layers. And I think that complexity is intentional. Like I want some mystery in the work simultaneously too. So this is again, a work which is, say, for example, is at the Harvard. So this is a stock character of the lovers on horseback, a very sort of a repetitive theme that you see in the historical miniatures. So here, what I did is like, I took that stock character, but then I also have this very celebratory and a destructive form, like these red flames imposed on it. So it erased the labor of my working first in the layers that are behind. And then further, also, I think this one is a mosaic version. So in sort of like making the mosaic, I was kind of further rupturing the site, which could be read as the destabilization of the motif itself, whether that motif is about heterosexual love, but nonetheless, it's that rupture. So that's where some other thing starts to happen alongside the image. This is another iconic form where, the character doesn't have a head, but it's very buoyant. It's not about it being beheaded, but about histories of, again, erasure. And then it's kind of doesn't have feet, it's looped in, so it's sort of carrying its root. It's also very buoyant and it can float around in space, it can float around, but it's self-referential. And I projected this image of really very large scale, so it was projected into space and it's falling on these on the trees itself. It's not Photoshop. Wow. And here, here it was almost like it was a homage of sorts to Doris Duke. So, but then this particular residency was the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. So again, I was like kind of looking at these sort of larger than life narratives around patronage, around feminine characters, as well as Doris Duke's whole history, her obsession with the Orient. which is again like a cross section into 1930s and 40s, and how so much of the art from Asia starts to kind of be collected in institutions and the histories of that.
So Shazia, I want to talk a little bit about drawing and how you kind of, even with this image, like how do you start? Do you start sketching first? Do you?
Yeah, I will sketch.
Collage? I mean, how do you start building these images? Because we've also talked about how some of your images, it's almost like how you would construct a poem, or there's kind of this free association that's taking place. And so at what point are you open to what comes? And then when do you start guiding the imagery?
Yeah, so definitely, I think of it, it starts, I like here the central two characters, you know, are again connected to this character. If you say it doesn't have the head, right? But here the bodies have been, they're more embellished. So you can see that there's a Greco-Roman thing going on in conversation with like perhaps an Indian aesthetic, we don't know. So then for me here, these are archetypes that I'm evolving and developing. And then as I developed them further, I started to think this was happening perhaps right after 9/11. So I was also thinking about the context of how, you know, so much of the war on terror, especially in Afghanistan, unfolded on the premise of like saving Muslim women and that kind of narrative, what that means versus how pleasure pillars started to speak back to such very paternalistic sort of gendered discourses. So I was thinking, okay, how can I bring that idea, the complexity of that? So that's where this painting started. And then recently, when I was thinking about some of these works, I was like, what if I cull out some of the protagonists that were very present in that period of my practice? And what happens if I make them in a three-dimensional form? Will the dynamics change? Will it lead to another conversation? What happens? So I think that's an example of where you see here. So you do recognize that these are the similar archetypes, but then one is the Indian Apsara or the Devi. It's actually at the Met, but at the Met it's further truncated. It has no limbs. So I kind of added that. I was also looking at temple sculpture and where the piece comes from, but it exists at the Met. So my reference is that.
Can you go back? Can you go back to your sculptures for a second? How large are these?
This is about 50 inches.
50? Okay.
Yeah. So
they're not quite life size.
It's in bronze. It's expensive.
Yes.
So I do hope, I would love to make something larger, but within the budget that I had, it's but you'll see, like, I think I have an image of how and of course it's like sources of inspiration are vast, like mannerism plays a role. I was also looking, I had made this image, right? The idea, the germ was done a while ago. At that time, I sketched out the concept, but it was for a banner for MoMA. And I was, it wasn't that important for me to declare the form as a three-dimensional idea, but I was still looking at the idea of classicism and the ethnocentric reactions that are there to Indian art in particular, and in the doctrine of like Winckelmann's doctrine in art history, right? The historical ideas there. So I was making a point of by entangling with the Indian art mannerism, then which is already an outsider kind of outcast of classical Western history, then I was playing on more nuances. So it wasn't like East and West. It was more so that at that time I was like, okay, you can't tell who is in a position of power between these two women. But when I actually made the sculpture itself, then more things came about, like the weight of the female. When is she carrying her weight on the shoulder? Mm-hmm. What is that a sexual relationship? What is the nature of the intimacy? Is it flirtatious, or is it about questioning the fascination that West had. So it's like the protagonist came alive in many other ways that they just didn't if it was a sketch. I had to think physically also in terms of like how to address it from the back, from the side. So I worked with models, as you can see, and then you know, the kind of like how the legibility and possibility of that gesture, if it's even possible. So had to first make sure that it was valid. And then as I developed it, then I was really more interested in the idea of color, like how color plays a role in this notion of antiquity. And, you know, most of it, so much of it was often colored is what I was understanding and hearing. And it wasn't necessarily just white or lily white as is often thought of.
Or, yeah, so you, I mean, so they were very ornate. Even the Greco-Roman sculptures were painted and they had jewelry and all kinds of things. But how come you chose to go with kind of a solid, monochromatic treatment of the bronze?
The treatment of bronze is that, you know, I was like, they're very sort of, I stuck with something that for me was injecting color, but also I didn't want them to be, they were already very two distinct contexts and two distinct things that things I was citing. So I wanted to make sure that if I was going to make both women brown, you know, it was a way of bringing the conversation visually together. And this idea of like, just like injecting them with color was enough. It didn't need to be that literal that I had to paint their eyes and color their lips, etc. So the color is also very similar to the palette I usually have in my drawings. But I kind of just wanted to read here that, you know, for me, when this kind of entanglement between the Greco-Roman Venus and the Indian Devata, it explores. And here I'm quoting Gayatri Gopinath, the scholar, promiscuous intimacies of multiple times, spaces, art historical traditions, bodies, desires, and subjectivities. So in their suggestive embrace, the entwined female bodies bear the symbolic weight of communal identities from across multiple temporal and geographical terrain. So this idea that even you know, they do evoke like a non-heteronormative desire, which is often cast as foreign and inauthentic. So I'm challenging the viewer that you can imagine a different way of understanding the past. But it's not about glorifying the past either. But when you think of culture, tradition, and archetypes or identity as not, you know, as unstable, and they're always moving in time, then these very distinct silos that we often examine in art history, that only, you know, that this is how Indian art has to be understood, and this is how like the foundation of Western art is, so it's in one way of reading Greco-Roman. Yet in proximity, there's a lot of influence in India, and there's a cross conversation happening with Greece throughout history. So that way of like how you can disrupt taken for granted categories. That's sort of like how I started the idea of the sculpture. And then of course, organically it had to grow and evolve the way it did. And the patina is already had the choices of patina are dependent on that kind of process, the artistic process that's going to unfold in the studio. So yeah, so
this is those are photos from your recent show at Sean Kelly Gallery that was just this fall, right?
Correct. In which there were other sort of aspects of the feminine. And here also, you know, this sort of like the two women that are kind of like a bloom that has risen to the surface, and they may be part of the environment, but they are also kind of, they're just part of the environment. So they're not kind of connected to any specific culture, history, tradition, but yet they are part of it. And yet as a flower, I was also playing in thematically in the show, you know, with the opium flower. And then the opium flower was also a symbol in revolutionary poetry, but also in the sort of histories of war, you know, in Afghanistan, so opium trade, all of that. So so that's where you see the mosaic. And the mosaic is all, for me, the mosaic is also about the idea of the pixel. So when I'm making, you know, animation, and it's all, you think of the unit as the digital idea of the pixel, then you approach the, then I think of the baggage of mosaic as a very old traditional historical art form kind of changes. I come to it from the pixel notion. So that's what you see on the left and in the back on the right piece. But I kind of wanted to just share also that this idea of drawing, right? You mentioned earlier, it's like, for me, it's like writing. It's a thinking tool. So I may be making I make lots and lots of drawings. They are often in ink. And so there's this kind of immediacy about them. And as I develop them, I can like scan them, and then they can go in the direction of animation and video, and then over there different narratives can be constructed, and, you know, conversations with, I can like use drawing as a way of collaborating with other languages. But all these different directions are connected to the idea of thinking through color, thinking through form, and thinking through the material of.
So for all of the drawings we just saw, you know, like, are you drawing constantly? Is it like a daily practice for you, or
I wish.
fits and spurts? And then also, like, how many drawings make the cut into something else, you know, or do you just, you know?
Yeah, good question.
Because when you're learning to draw, they say, you know, you have to make 10,000 bad drawings before you can start making good drawings. So it's like, it is a way to process quickly information and form and color. But at what point do they become more solid than just sketches?
You know, some of them, like some of these, they've remained in their sketch form. And in their sketch form, they have so many different associations, like, you know, sort of like how so many of the women narratives are kind of connected to the monstrous. So when I was thinking of that, I was also thinking of these little protagonists, you know, where they actually come from. I'll share, I think I have that image here, by looking at objects that usually would be placed in books around these very sort of large, broad books on Indian art or Islamic art. And in there are like shadowless representations that, you know, like swords or ceramics or miniature paintings. And then, and I was like, I always thought that they were like trapped in their representation. And what if they decided to exit that book? And if they became animated, what would happen? They'd crawl out of the pages and choose their categories, or choose to be without any categories. So some of the characters that you were seeing were really through those ideas of observing representations of artifacts, and then thinking of them in terms of the body. And earlier I was talking about, you know, how the notion of flight is a theme in the work often. So here, just an example, like I've removed the face of the female, and just her head, the bun, is left. And then that becomes like a particle system that can be choreographed and composed. So code written where it moves around in space. Here's another example of that idea. So a painting that I did, and then I kind of started to dismantle the form, the characters disappear and just the hair remains. And as I was thinking about that, I was also scanning the different stages of the painting so I could depart in the direction of animation simultaneously. So that's another sort of way of how, you know, layers function in the work. Even in the act of making the art, it can start going in different directions.
Mm-hmm.
And then I you know, here too, it's like that the unit of that hair, when it would descend at midnight in this work that I did in Times Square, it had completely different new associations. It was really kind of, it was at midnight, so it sometimes did feel people thought they were bats, or it was, you know, mysterious. And yet for me, it was also like, here's state-of-the-art technology, and I'm really playing with the motif that comes right out of the illuminated manuscript. And I've not altered the shape of the hair, but what I've done is, in its multiplication, it becomes incredibly fluid.
Right.
But when you reduce it to its singular unit, it retains its shape. So it can fit right back into the illuminated manuscript, but it can be sort of, you know, it can depart and be free to create its new associations. And that's how I think of many trenchant historical iconographies.
So Shazia, you talk a lot about flight and rootedness or unrootedness. How do you feel about where you are in terms of, you've been in the States for about 30 years, you travel a lot. I mean, do you feel like you have roots as an artist? I mean, like,
you know, like, I think that idea of roots or home, you know, of course it's embedded in the work. I think for many artists, for many people, like, you know, it's in the act of making, in the act of writing, that's where things happen. That's what, you know, the work is where the idea of rootedness is. And for me, that's really critical, is that I'm like engaged in the work. And when whichever work that I'm creating, it's there's a lot of research there. And in the act of research, and, you know, it's done over a period of time, even like this project Parallax that I did, it's a film that we worked with. It was about the colonial histories in the Strait of Hormuz, but done for a contemporary biennial, Sharjah Art Biennial, in collaboration with poets there, as well as the composer that I've been working with. And, you know, even some of the themes in there were dealing with histories that are about resources, and how sort of resources move across trade, and what that means, and what are, you know, who are the stakeholders. And so it was no longer just about the Strait of Hormuz. It was really about, from there, it very much is about imperial history. So it was also about oil. It was also about trade. And so that's how I see the work, that, you know, it is very expansive. And for me, that's how I think formally also, like in terms of how forms can expand and narrow and kind of like exist in multiple dimensions, in multiple scales, in multiple languages, and carry that kind of carry their little DNA as they go in different directions. Yeah, I wanted to share a little bit of this, like, just, you know, just like as an example, like when I was researching oil histories at that time, I was looking at the British petroleum magazines and printed at that in the region. And I came across this photograph on the right, which was on the oil rigs. I, at that time, did not know that oil rigs were called Christmas trees. And when I read it, I remember thinking, oh, maybe that's a very English humor, the gift-bearing sentiment or something. So then from that image, I actually created these forms that play with that iconography. And then that informed so much more in terms of like going in the direction of, climate too. And this piece Flared, which I made last year when there was so much like wildfires going on in California, right?
Yeah, wildfires is a huge climate issue out here. But one of the things that was, when reading the book, there were a couple notions that were brought up, because even in talking about this, even when you were talking about the piece that had the opium kind of flower with the two women's heads in it, there's somebody used this term, kind of the economic culture of extraction and kind of scarcity versus the idea of abundance and equity, and kind of how your work brings up a lot of issues about the economic structures. And I mean, that ties in with imperialism and colonialism, but also post-colonialism, and kind of how things move through the world. And what is popular, what's not. I mean, it impacts the art world too, as to the ownership of art and these objects, and you having to come to the United States or to go to England to study Pakistani art. It brings all of that in.
I think like that history, for example, what you're talking about right now is a, perfect example right here is when that sketch on the left is Adam Smith's. And then, the context that I found, it's like now Adam Smith is very much part of this prominent artwork in the economics building at Princeton. So right there you see that, that things are kind of, they're organic, happening simultaneously, but then they get cemented. The context, the fact that it's dressed like it's dressed in the East India Company attire.
Mm-hmm.
So his lofty ideas are there, but the character is unable to fly. It's sort of like stuck there. And that also is how, so much of that economic history is still kind of continuous. Mm-hmm. And we're still caught in that same sort of history. So then I was like, I was thinking of that if he has grown wings, but maybe he's still entrapped. And if I entrap him in luminous glass, but he's unable to fly, but the ideas are still lofty, but then patterns of inequity of wealth are still there. So this paradox, and then it got translated through this character that I sketched out first on the page, and then it's painted in glass at a much higher, larger scale. The piece on the right is like part of a 30-foot glass piece that's at the that speaks to the sort of economic histories and movements.
Right.
There are different characters in there. There's a portrait of Stasis as well, and there's another piece also here.
Shazia, I'm going to interrupt just for a second, because I just wanted to, we've kind of come to our time to kind of open it up to Q&A. So if anyone has any questions that you'd like us to address, just put them in the Q&A box. And but I want to hear more about this piece too. So keep talking, and then I'll bring in some questions from the audience.
Yeah, so here you can see, the scale changing very dramatically. This is about 70 feet. It goes through 3 floors, so from the bottom of the building all the way to the top. And it plays again on, the overarching themes are around human economic interconnectivity. And, basically in literary ideas, the pursuit of truth. So sort of there's reference to history, there's reference to kind of some religion, literature, but how I conceive of my work is like, it's like a poem. And the format itself is, like the idea of the scroll. So you walk through the piece, and in terms of how I create art, the drawings were done to scale, and then the drawings then are translated in a medium which has longevity, because glass and tile and marble, all of that material then translates the actual drawing, but very hands-on, where I wanted to make sure that, you know, the depth comes through. So it's not just a reproduction of the image of the art, but like choices that one is making in terms of like certain shapes and character of the piece, keeping it ungrouted so that it doesn't become flat. It's more sculptural. So all these things play a role in terms of how the drawing functions.
So Shazia, we've got a question that's come in. It's actually a couple questions that are all kind of connected. It's, this person would like to know that you mentioned about colonial interpretation of these manuscripts. Do you feel that your work is a commentary on that interpretation, and how so? And also, what inspired you to work in this particular field? I think we covered a little bit of that, but why don't you elaborate?
Yeah, so you know, I became interested in the manuscript in Pakistan as a student, because when I joined the National College of Art, I saw that there was a department called the miniature painting department, and I was interested in understanding like what miniature painting was, and how come I didn't really know much about it. And then at that time, I also realized that it wasn't considered hip or considered intellectually vigorous for a young art student to take on. And then that made me really try to understand, like, oh, then why do we have it here? What is its history? You know, all the sort of dynamics of that. And the more I started to kind of understand that, then I started to become interested in this, who gets to perform this notion of tradition, and who's writing about the history of the region. And if it's only being written by Western scholarship from the 60s and 70s, and that's what our dated textbooks are telling me about, this is what miniature painting is, I want to understand it on my own terms. So that's how I kind of got into it. And also because it's the visual traditions of the region, and I could not access them. We didn't grow up with the Met, you know, in our city. So I was like, okay, I'm learning it from books that are being curated outside of the country. And if somebody is sharing a book or two, then it's such an indirect way of understanding the region's visual dynamic. Right. And that's when my interest became, you know, and then at that time I thought, okay, maybe I can do an art history. But what was available at that time was to work with the master teacher and to learn the actual language and the technique and the craft, and really delve deep into it, which was fine for me, but it was pretty rigorous.
Yeah. And the craft has led you, someone else's, Janet Hadley has actually asked that you work in so many different mediums and scales. How did you get the expertise and the skill set to be able to move between, you know, drawing to painting to making animations to doing mosaics?
Yeah, so
performances, etc.
So it's over a long period of time, 30 plus years. It's very hard to like narrow it.
Well, you still look very young, so
it's hard to get, you know, how do you like, so yeah. That's one thing for sure. Then of course, as I said, like for me, the something that is very close and immediate is the hand, like drawing. Mm-hmm. So when you think of it in that way, every idea or thing that's going to come about is first through the concept and exploration of drawing. So I'll draw it out. And as I draw it, the drawings can be simpler or they can be layered. They can evolve into more density and become paintings on paper, if you would like to call them paintings then, although often, like, you know, people, if it's on paper, it'll always be considered drawing. And then from there, if you're working in other mediums, then you're like, I'm working with also people that are really good with animation. So a longtime collaborator of mine is Patrick, and you know, he and I work together on the animations too. So so like, I'm not, so then when you're thinking collaboration, then you're really thinking also the language that the collaborator brings in. So even in terms of composition, I'm not sitting there and composing the music. Duyan composes, it's her, but my collaborations have happened and continue over a long period of time. So it's
even your bronze sculptures, that's a collaboration with a foundry.
Yes, so like in that sense, like the foundry that works with the material of bronze, they will cast it, and so
and
these
also
are,
probably give your advice about, like, you can't do this. Can you make,
you know, and also like even for printmaking processes, like you're working with a print workshop,
printer,
right? So when you're working, like, because these images are right in front of me, I worked, this was a long time ago, but even with Crown Point Press at that time, even now with Pace Editions, like you're working with master printmakers simultaneously while you're working on the copper plates yourself too. So so when you think of that in that way, that's sort of, you know, it's a, but for me, even when I'm engaging with other languages, right, they're not that separate from the language that I'm in, like,
you're still dealing with color, pattern, scale.
Like, yeah, like this animation here is very much driven by my drawings.
Right.
It's not coming about because there's a software out there that's going to make it.
Right.
So that's what I want to say, is the essence of the work, and the entire work is really about the kind of malleability of drawing, and how I think drawing, for me, drawing transcends culture in different ways than maybe a painting does, because painting, contemporary painting, is very much centered in the Western canon of oil on canvas, right? So I'm working with fluid materials like ink and watercolor, opaque watercolor, transparent watercolor, but very much the material that has been associated with
a material where it's kind of this ephemeral material, but there's also a permanence and a boldness to it, that it's got a presence in the world. It's not going to disappear. So I like that juxtaposition, because you're very much about kind of contradictions. And I know we're kind of coming to the end of our talk, and one audience member has asked if they wanted to learn more about kind of contemporary Pakistani art, how would they go about doing that?
Google. There's a lot of information out there.
Yeah.
And you know, there's literally.
Yeah.
You will find, like, names will pop up, and then you go check their websites.
Well, even well, the nice thing about your book too is that you reference a lot of other artists and writers and poets in your work. And we're going to wrap up, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions, but there are two things I wanted to mention. Is Shazia has another book that just came out by the Museum of Modern Art. It's called Roots and Wings, and it's how Shazia became an artist. And it's a children's book, which I think you have a few images we can see, which is very exciting. And it's a great story. There was the quote I love in there, because you are kind of this, you know, you have so many skills and you're blessed with so many talents. And you love math, which is amazing, because not a lot of artists love math. But the quote from the children's book was, drawing like math is a tool, a way to figure out the world. And it's really wonderful to see how you see this our world that we live in. And it's been wonderful spending an evening with you. So I just want to say thank you. And I also want to, we're so excited, and I hope everyone can go and visit your show.
Yes, so the show is going to be in New York, and then it'll travel to the Rhode Island School of Design's museum in the fall of this year from the Morgan Library, and then the MFA Houston also next year.
Oh,
So
how exciting.
we'll get a chance.
That's wonderful. So you have 3 opportunities, everyone, to go see her show. And I also just want to say this, Shazia, you've wrapped up our Witte series, the 24th season of the Witte series, beautifully. And I want to thank all of our sponsors and the Witte family for making this annual event possible. The final thing I want to say is the Library Live is going to have its final program on May 14th. With Stephen Rowley, who is the author of The Editor, Lily and the Octopus, and his upcoming book called Gunkel. So it should be an exciting evening, and we hope you'll visit the website and sign on, and we hope to see you on May 14th. So everyone, thank you all. Thank you, Shazia, and we hope to see you again soon. Okay.